Welcome to Gluck Radio. I am Dr. Errol Gluck, executive life coach and master problem solver. Today we're joined by Jesse Bering, psychologist and author of Perv, the sexual deviant in all of us. The word pervert alone conjures up passionate feelings, both exciting and disturbing. Bering is here to reclaim the word, and he invites readers to unpack the morality of sexual deviance. From the slightly strange spanking to the flat-out bizarre amputee fetish, Bering will expand your sexual horizons and challenge your preconceived notions. More importantly, Bering will force you to hold the mirror up to your own kinks and fetishes, whether you're aware of them or not.
We'll determine the difference between abnormal and harmful when it comes to the highly subjective matter of sexuality. We'll ask whether the age of consent is a good thing, and why there are no female pedophiles, and why exactly is 50 Shades of Grey so popular.
To quote Oscar Wilde, you may find that you have your own version of love that dare not speak its name. Jesse, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Your book is, I think everyone is going to walk by it and kind of browse through it, and we're going to encourage them to actually pick it up, because everyone has their own little private skeleton in fantasy life. But I want you to start and define for me, what is a pervert?
Well, it's a very different thing now than it was when the word was coined hundreds of years ago, actually. It means something very different now. It originally meant an atheist. To call somebody a pervert was basically to accuse somebody of going against the word of God, going against biblical prescriptions, to pervert the natural world in some fashion in that way. And it was only sexualized. So it had no sexual reference at all for hundreds of years with its original use. It was only sexualized toward the end of the 19th century during the Victorian era, when a British sexologist named Havelock Ellis used the word pervert to refer to inverts, which was his clinical term for gays and lesbians, people who had an inverted form of sexual attraction. And he used that word pervert to refer to gays and lesbians, not because he himself saw them as somehow going against God's word, but because he was using this in a way that suggested that's how the majority of the society would view them. They were somehow perverting God's natural design. But unfortunately, that word pervert stuck, and it stuck especially with gays and lesbians for a long time. Now we use it for anybody with any type of sexual deviance, really.
I think that by the point when you said sexual deviance, now perversion, when you hear it, you think of something twisted. To pervert,
yeah,
to twist.
Very loaded term.
Right, correct. And deviance is simply, going away from the norm. And I would think, and you would, obviously you're the expert here, that the norms are what were established by the different tribes and cities and societies, and the norms are different. The Spartans had a homosexual army that was second to none.
Right.
And yet homosexuality in a religious sense in Judeo-Christian Islamic is still seen as a perversion. Right. Are there certain perversions that are inherently dangerous to society?
I think that there are a number of sexual orientations, and I use even this. I mean, this is where the terminology becomes so slippery with this type of topic. I use orientation to refer to any paraphilia. Yeah, I would call. Today I would use the word pervert to refer to anybody who's unnecessarily sort of pathologically interfering in the healthy sex life of another individual. If that individual is not causing any ostensible harm to themselves or to another. So there are types of sexual behaviors, I think, that are inherently harmful. Some of the more obvious ones, for instance, I think would be pedophilia, when people actually act on their desires for prepubescent children, I think we're running into some serious harm-based problems with an orientation like that. And I still would call pedophilia a sexual orientation, because an orientation is really simply what your brain or your genitals orient to. It's as simple as that, and it could be as unsettling as pedophilia or as normal.
But Jesse, that's my question to you. Meaning, when I think of perversion, I don't think of one's preference in terms of fetish or how one acts out the sexual life. I think of one violating another person's innocence, or or something that is in fact immoral. If you want to, make love to your shoe, I don't see that as immoral. That's your personal preference. So wouldn't you agree that there are some perversions that are actually immoral by virtue of the fact that they dominate or take advantage of someone who's not a willing participant?
Yes, but I do think it's important to distinguish between the psychosexual identity of the individual and any actions that arise from that psychosexual identity. So we know, for instance, with pedophilia, that not all pedophiles actually act on their sexual desires for children. In fact, up to half of all molestation cases, sexual abuse cases involving children are committed by people who are not technically pedophiles. They're using children as a surrogate for a preferred, more sexually mature adult partner. They're exploiting and sexually abusing them in that way. So I think what we have to distinguish is the sexual desires and the sexual behaviors. Desires for me, thoughts, desires, fantasies, imagination. Those things to me do not have any sort of moral value, because they cannot harm, they cannot interfere with the innocence or trespass on the innocence of somebody else. If they're not actually translated into behavior that causes harm, then the only harm potentially that could arise is to the individual, him or herself.
One of your arguments is that fantasy itself can preempt behavior in pedophilic situations. That is to say that pornography actually works as a preventative because it operates on the fantasy. It leaves the hands on people out of the mix, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's that discussion was based on some research by an evolutionary biologist and a sexologist named Milton Diamond, who actually looked at societies where various types of pornography were prohibited for a long period of time, or allowed, and the effects on having access to pornography on different types of sexual crimes. And he looked at the Czech Republic, for instance, and during one period of time, no pornography was allowed whatsoever. Even Playboy, even the most innocuous types of pornography was strictly prohibited and prevented for a long period of time. And then all of a sudden, the floodgates opened, and all sorts of things were allowed, including child pornography. And what he found, rather shockingly, was that when child pornography was actually legal, this translated to a period of time where rates of child molestation and sexual abuse against children actually declined significantly. So with access to child pornography, offenses against children actually dropped precipitously. Now, obviously, the really difficult matter here is the fact that, well, that might be true, but still, what about all the children who are sexually exploited and abused for the production of that child pornography?
Right, and then I wouldn't really agree with that. I remember the argument was along, before Prohibition, there were 600 bars in New York City, and after there were 6,000. But I do think that whenever, I do clinical hypnosis based on neuroplasticity. Whenever you're watching pornography, you're making neurological connections, and those connections get stronger and stronger. Just like if you're watching someone smoke or drink, over and over again, you're going to have more of an appetite. So, I would not be a fan at all of any type of child pornography or any type of pornography that would, again, endanger someone innocent. Whether it's a fetish, I think people are all different, and what turns them on, whether it's sight, smell, touch, I think that's really a personal issue. Even bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, as long as there's a safe word, as long as there's willing participants, I don't see much of a problem in that. But what I want to know from you is, what are the perversions that have gone over time from let's say, the 13th century to now? What has changed? What have you learned about fetishes, and what are the common ones right now?
Well, I mean, one interesting thing is that the nature of a fetish or a kink or a paraphilia does change with developments in technology, for instance. I mean, you wouldn't find somebody with a latex fetish in, 14th century France, because there wasn't such thing as latex at that time. So something is happening developmentally, I think, where the child is imprinted on something in the environment that is present in that particular time and culture. That leads to their adult sexual orientation. So we find fundamentally new types of paraphilias and new types of fetishes with these changes or advances in technology, and those will continue to develop with advances such as in robotics. So we see things now that we didn't see hundreds of years ago, not because we're a much more immoral or lax or tolerant type of society now than we were a couple of hundred years ago, but just simply because the range of things in our environment developmentally has expanded exponentially.
So the person who is considering himself a pervert, or is it society that considers that person a pervert? Like, tell me, what would be your modern definition of a pervert that you would think is a pervert?
Well, to me, it's based on harm. I mean, really, it all boils down to harm. I think that we're spending far too much time worrying about and dawdling over and being preoccupied with what is normal and what is natural. I think those are meaningless philosophical questions. I think it gets us absolutely nowhere. It tells us absolutely nothing about whether something is wrong or right, simply based on the frequency of the action in other human societies or across the animal kingdom and other species. It makes no sense for me whatsoever. For instance, I mean, I'm a gay man, so I'm quite sympathetic to arguments that are based on the rhetoric. Well, homosexuality is found in all these other species, therefore it must be okay for us too. Well, there are lots of things that other species do sexually that we would, and I think that we should have problems with at a moral, ethical level. But we're not advocating. There's lots of sexual coercion, for instance, male to female aggression and sexual violence in other species. There's sex with reproductively immature juveniles, and bonobos, for instance, are most closely related species. But we don't find arguments for those types of behaviors in human beings just because they're present in these other closely related species. So again, I think we got to move away from what's normal and what's natural to the question of what's harmful. And to me, a pervert is somebody who intentionally is causing harm to somebody else through their sexual behaviors.
Are there any forces in society today that are fostering this harmful behavior? I'm thinking really the sexualization of children, for example, that's so pervasive, or maybe pornography, or types of pornography.
Yeah, I don't see it necessarily that way, actually. I see pornography being more of a reflection of something inherent about the person's sexuality. I mean, they're finding an outlet for for whatever happens to arouse them. They're finding what their match is more readily online today. It's easier for them, I think, to access these things, but it doesn't mean that they would be operating without these desires in the absence of pornography.
So you don't think pornography is actually directing their desires in a certain way? I
don't think that it is the cause or the and plays any sort of formative role in the nature of their sexual desires or their sexual orientation. Now, that's not to say that there isn't something happening at a neurological level in terms of brain plasticity and the reward system. With looking at pornography and masturbating continually to different types of images and the connections that built up over time. But I think that it's still, the pornography that a person seeks out is going to be largely a reflection of what's already present in that person's, what's already present in that person's mind. So, for instance, the fact that there's a plethora of straight porn available for me as a gay man, I'm just simply never going to look at straight porn. It's just not attractive. It's not appealing to me. It's not interesting to me. So it's not something that would have any sort of significant effects on my sexual orientation if I were to look at it repeatedly over time.
I think my only concern with pornography is not the contents at all. It's the potential addiction. I know a lot of people who, their pornography is just straight pornography and they're not going to go out and harm anyone, but they spend literally 5-6 hours of a working day looking at pornography, and therefore their businesses and their other personal relationships are harmed by that. And that for me would be a problem. Even, it's the difference between someone who drinks socially and someone who's an alcoholic. It's not the alcohol. You have to know how it's going to affect you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it does become a problem when it's interfering with the person's life in a way that that person is uncomfortable with. So when they can't stop themselves and it is causing problems in their personal life, in their social life, in their work life, yes, and that's a major issue.
And it could... I'm sorry. I was just going to say it contributes also, don't you think, to female dominance? I mean, the whole concept of heterosexual pornography is that the woman is submissive and looks a certain way, and that's scripting male desires, don't you think?
Well, there's lots of pornography, different types of pornography. It's not just all subscribing to that particular dynamic. Mm-hmm. But no, not necessarily. I mean, again, I would take the perspective rather that it is simply a reflection of these evolved characteristics between men and women that we see played out in the sort of the standard narrative heterosexual script in pornographic scenes. And I think that is reflected by the percentage, for instance, of the ratio of sadists to masochists in the S&M community in males and females. Women are much more likely to be the passive or the masochistic partner in the relationship than the dominant or sadistic individual.
Jess,
I think. Sorry,
Jess. Jess, you had an experience with the foot fetishes.
I did.
Yeah, tell me what that was like, and tell me, where do you believe fetish actually comes from in terms of the brain or desire? But what was your experience like?
Well, it was my first sexual experience with another man, actually. He just happened to be a foot fetishist or a podophile. And this is when I knew absolutely nothing about these types of phenomena. And he just simply proceeded to attend to my toes in a way that I wasn't anticipating in the scene going, basically. And it was awkward. It was uncomfortable. I didn't bring it up with him because I didn't want to embarrass him. I mean, it was clear to me that he was deriving some sort of gratification or pleasure from this interaction. I found it enormously puzzling and mind-boggling because I think my feet are absolutely disgusting and atrocious when it comes to feet, but he seemed quite enamored with them. So it was only later that I kind of learned more about podophilia, this foot fetishism. And although we still don't know exactly, where it comes from, we do know that it's quite common. Lots of people have have a foot fetish or a shoe fetish. It's the most common form of partialism, which is an attraction to a body part. And if you ask adults where it came from, they'll oftentimes tell you these very specific, detailed stories about something in their early childhood. And usually it's quite young, between the ages of about 4 and 9. Something happened where they were wrestling with an older brother, and the brother's foot just happened to fly in their face while they happened to have an erection or something. Or maybe they were massaging their parents' feet, their mother's feet, and the mother was groaning in pleasure, just kind of showing that she was enjoying it, and it happened to sexually arouse them at the time. But once it was set into motion, it was something that could never be changed. It was irreversible in terms of the arousal response.
Well, that's an interesting question. So do you believe that fetishes and certain perversions are hardwired into the person as opposed to soft-wired?
Depends on what you mean by that distinction exactly.
It means can they reorient themselves? Let's say that they have a fetish, towards the shoes or feet or pornography. Do you think that they could, in fact, develop a alternative sexual experience if they deem the first one to be not as productive as it possibly could be?
I think theoretically it's possible, but empirically there's absolutely no evidence that paraphilias or fetishes can be changed in any meaningful sense in terms of lessening the arousal response or turning it off entirely.
How about nymphomaniacs?
Well, I mean, nymphomania, of course, was something that was diagnosed quite frequently, about 150 years ago in Victorian era society. But basically, it was used for any woman that had any sexual desire, even sort of a normal sexual desire, or was masturbating. She was considered to be a nymphomaniac. Today, the word is not. It's an old-fashioned term. It's not even used in contemporary clinical models. But there is this concept of hypersexuality still, which is used for both sexes, which defines some sort of excessive sexual desire, or sexual orientation that is within societal standards of acceptability. So too much pornography, too many strip clubs, too much casual sex with people that you don't know, that sort of thing. People that go over the limit, whatever that limit is defined as, would be considered hypersexual today. But even that's a very problematic concept. But women are much less likely to be diagnosed with hypersexuality than men are.
What I suggest is that this has to do with social conditioning. I mean, women have been sexually suppressed for so many generations that they're less apt to confess their true desires. You say there's a real disconnect between the genitals and their desires. Well, yes. That could be because they're inhibited in that way, because women are stronger performers sexually. They are lustier, according to Helen Fisher and Company, than men. Yes, there are 5 male hypersexuals to 1 woman, but yeah. I wonder where that study came from, because women are quite lusty, not just when they're ovulating or when they want to particularly get it on with some special man or whatever the environment is. They have a lot of nerve endings, like 8,000 clitoral nerve endings and 15,000 pudendal. So that's double men's. So we have a lusty group of women there, kind of Maseratis, if you will. And society has been at great pains to suppress that, I mean, almost since the beginning of history. Mm-hmm. I mean, the strength of the prohibition obviously reflects the strength of the desire. So they weren't locked up and put in purdah for no reason. There was a terror, actually, that these women would run wild with their runaway sexuality.
I think men are actually afraid of sexually aggressive women because women are clearly sexually superior. They don't have to perform. They don't have to get the erection. They're multi-orgasmic, far beyond men. What has your studies just brought up?
Well, one interpretation for that disconnect between genital arousal and conscious arousal in women is an evolutionary one, and this is an argument called the "ready for anything" hypothesis by Meredith Chivers,
Hmm.
whose claim basically is that women would have evolved to be genitally aroused by things that they're not even consciously attracted to in the ancestral past, because this would have been uh, a measure that would have protected their bodies from some type of sexual assault, basically rape, that would have damaged their reproductive anatomy, and ultimately that would have been uh, problematic at an adaptive evolutionary level. Because if their physical body is damaged, obviously their genetic fitness is going to be impaired as well, or impacted negatively as well. So so her interpretation is not simply that they are more sexual in some sort of lust-worthy fashion, but more that their bodies are more responsive to signals or signs of implicit sexuality in the environment, because it would have served this sort of evolutionarily adaptive function in preserving their genetic interests.
Yeah, there's another evolutionary idea, of course, that women, by being promiscuous and coupling with many, many men, are able to uh, acquire the best sperm, so that it's in their interest to be promiscuous. And they also get more male protectors that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the nature of whether it's a long-term or short-term reproductive strategy.
Hmm.
It's going to depend on the particular environmental conditions, of course. But surreptitious mating,
Hmm.
where women are ostensibly in long-term romantic pairships with a man, but on the side, they're having sex with others and searching for men that have potentially better quality genes,
Right,
um,
right,
and maybe even cuckolding
right.
their presumably monogamous partner. That's that's an age-old reproductive tactic that's found across society. So
Yeah,
there's definitely no evidence that monogamy is the
the
natural,
norm, right?
yeah, is the norm, or something that
Exactly.
we have evolved to be.
I think it's right now what society can handle from simply a governmental point of view, and I think that most of the laws laid down, whether they were religious or civil, was simply for the management of society as best as they could. I don't think it had anything to do with what's real or not real, but what's manageable. I want to ask you this about nature versus nurture. In your book, you mentioned just that you would grope when you were younger. How did that register or affect you? And do you believe that most fetishes are about nurture rather than nature?
Well, my incident was fairly, you know, not terribly eventful in terms of my own sexual development. I mean, it happened when I was maybe 12 or 13. I was at a department store, and some random man touched my backside, and it was uncomfortable. It was awkward, especially at that age, of course. Verging on something that could have turned into a much more significant problem for me. But but it's not something that I would say, harmed me at any sort of deep psychological level. It was more sort of in the category of weird, looking back at it now. And so I don't, that particular incident, at least for me, had no bearing on my development in terms of my sexuality. I think already at that point it was clear enough that I was gay, so I don't think it had any sort of role in my sexual desire for the same sex. I knew that I was gay by the time I was probably 6 or 7. So I don't see nurture being playing a I think that there's a false dichotomy, to make a long story short, between nature and nurture. I mean, I think it's an interaction between these two things. Um, we probably come into the world with a particular predisposition foregoing in one way or the other in terms of what our ultimate sexual identities are going to be. We need some sort of input from the environment to sort of trigger that or release it.
Right, but I'm not talking about that. I absolutely agree. We come into the world with a inherent sexual identity, but do we come into the world with an inherent fetish?
No, because I think that it's so specific, oftentimes, the nature of a fetish or a kink or a paraphilia, that that it has to come from our developmental or learning experiences outside of the womb. So to go back, for instance, to the latex fetish, it's not something you're not born with a latex fetish. You obviously need to be imprinted with latex to develop that particular kink, because that wasn't something that hundreds of generations of human beings had prior to our technologically sophisticated society.
You argue that men are imprinted more than women, that women's sexuality is more fluid, more elastic over time.
Yeah. So, right. So I think this is why men are locked into a particular type of thing. Men know what they like. Whether they're always willing to tell somebody what that is another question.
Mm-hmm.
But women can be aroused by a broader array of things. They either escape the imprinting process, or the imprinting process developmentally is not as dramatic as it is for them. I mean, certainly there are women who will share stories with you, and I came across quite a few stories of women talking about their, childhood or adolescent experiences and how that plays out in their adult kinks and fetishes and interests. But they're not dependent on it for sexual gratification. It's more of an aphrodisiac for them.
Do you think that couples who are dating and it's getting a little bit more serious should talk about their fetishes and explore that which turns them on before they go further into being engaged or getting married?
I think so, yeah. I mean, especially for somebody who has a certifiable paraphilia. I mean, a paraphilia is really a clinical condition where they need something very specific to be sexually aroused and to be gratified. So I think that the person should have a frank conversation with the partner, if that is the case. In the book, I talk about a man who was an amputee fetishist, and he could only obtain an orgasm by either having sex with or imagining he's having sex with a woman with an amputation. And he had a history of dating prostitutes with amputations, and he finally met a woman who lost her leg, I believe, to cancer when she was younger. And he married her. He found her attractive, but he never had this conversation with her. He never talked about the fact that he had an amputee fetish. And it was only once she discovered a collection of amputee porn, looking through his computer, that she came across this secret of his. And then it was a major disaster for their relationship, because she felt like she'd been misled. She felt like the only reason he was with her was because of her amputation, like she was a freak and so on. But I think, I don't know if he would have been honest with her up front. I'm not sure if she would have been comfortable with the relationship to begin with. But I do think it would only be fair to her if he would have been more honest with her at the beginning. On the other hand, I'm not sure it's completely reasonable for her to be that upset, because really it's no different in principle than somebody being attracted to a brunette, or somebody with people who had green eyes or blue eyes. The fact that he attracted to a woman missing her leg is just another physical characteristic. He also loved her. It's not like he didn't love her at a romantic interpersonal level as well.
But you point out that a fetish itself is the love object and not the person. So in that case, she had a reason, I guess, to be upset, because the real love object was the amputation, not herself.
Yeah, I think that that is the love object. You're right, but I think that it's more about lust when we're talking about these types of things, and love and lust in the best type of relationship go hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive. And in that case, there was evidence that they had otherwise they had a normal, healthy, functional, loving relationship.
And the way I see it is kind of close, because if you're attracted, to a certain look within a woman. She's thin, she's blonde. She has a perfect butt, and then you're with her for a number of years, and the love grows. And some of those features that you were attracted to are no longer there. It doesn't mean that the relationship ends.
Absolutely. And I mean, love for me trumps lust all the time. It's something that is much more important than lust in a relationship. But I think that lust is terribly important as well for the long-term health and well-being of any type of relationship. So again, I think when you've got both in the same dynamic, that's what makes for a healthy partnership. But the fact that looks may fade isn't necessarily a death knell for the relationship. That's one of the reasons I think that the human imagination is so terribly important when it comes to sexuality too. I'm not saying that we should be fantasizing about having sex with somebody else while we're with our partner, but the fact is that lots of people do that. And who knows, the precise figures of, who's actually pretending to have sex with somebody else in their head while they're having sex with their partner. But it does raise some interesting philosophical questions. I mean, who really are we having sex with if that is the case?
I want to ask a really bigger and broader question here. Why is the state involved in human sexuality at all? I mean, every society throughout history has regulated sexuality. Why?
Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, but I do think it is an important issue. It was incredibly disconcerting to me to discover just how naive the legislators were about human sexuality, and those are the people making these terribly important decisions for how we live our lives. As somebody who has a real personal interest in gay marriage being legal, this is something that is terribly worrisome to me.
Betsy, I'm going to answer that question for you, because the reason why the government gets involved is simply that they are trying to attract certain voting blocks. They couldn't care less. The ones who are making the rules, their sexual life is all over the place. Now with the internet, they're scared, shitless, because you can't do anything without everyone knowing it. But historically, whether it was in European society or in religious circles, those at the top did whatever they wanted to, but they made those who they ruled conform to strict behavior.
But you don't think that sex itself is intrinsically disruptive and anarchic?
In what sense?
Well,
disruptive in what sense?
In the sense of harm that we were talking about earlier, that there are aspects of sexuality that are destructive, that imperil social order.
I don't think that sex between consulting adults, if it does not take away from them functioning as a part of society, I don't think it's anyone's business but their own.
Yeah, I agree. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the lawmakers just stuck to issues of harm, then we would be on much firmer ground here than we are otherwise. But the fact that they are meddling in the lives of consenting adults who simply are in love with each other and want to have sex with each other, that's where it becomes an issue. But
the fact that it's been present throughout history is so bizarre. It raises so many unanswerable questions, I guess.
Yeah, actually, I mean, there was a story in the news recently about the Swiss cheese pervert. I'm not sure if you saw that. There was some man who was, I think he was in Philadelphia, and he was an exhibitionist. He was driving around in his car, pantless, pulling up to strange women with a block of Swiss cheese and telling these women that he would pay for them to rub the cheese on his penis.
Which congressman was this?
It wasn't a congressman. At least I don't think it was. They actually, but I just saw, I think yesterday, they raided his house. They arrested him. He's facing some felonious,
cheese charges.
And it's obviously what he was doing, I think, is a problem, is wrong. But if you saw the SWAT team that went to his house to take him out, it seemed a little excessive, to be honest,
Yeah,
for an incident like that.
I was in Florida last year and opened the newspaper, and some poor man had had a romantic relationship with his mule and had been thrown in jail for 7 years. Same idea.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about zoophilia in the book.
Yeah, I know you do.
And the fact that a lot of the laws about bestiality are based more on sort of our disgust factor, and not the harm factor, is readily apparent when we think about all the other horrific things that we do to animals. Inserting your penis into a horse or a donkey where they probably can't even feel it. Being slaughtered by 9-inch steel blades for our food. Which is worse, and why is one legal and the other one isn't? I'm not saying that either one is necessarily good, but I'm saying that we don't oftentimes think very deeply about why we have such draconian measures against bestiality.
Again, we do because most of the religious or all the religious sects, whether it's Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Islam, they have laws against it, and I believe it is out of their true belief that it is a violation against God.
Yeah, it's a violation against natural law. Absolutely.
Right.
And
right.
Absolutely. Although even on the books today, in terms of the law, you wouldn't find a lot of that sort of religious type of discussion. But I do think it is rooted in that at its core. Yes.
Have you noticed? Would you consider yourself a pervert?
No, not really. Not because I don't. I mean, not in terms of my own definition, which is the intentional causing of harm to another. Others, would probably look at me, and just by virtue of the fact that I'm gay, a large segment of society would probably consider me a pervert still. But I do consider myself a sexual deviant in the fact that my patterns of attraction are not in the sort of heteronormative camp. But pervert to me is a negative word, and it should be a negative word. But I think that we've used it inappropriately, and we continue to do so.
How do you feel about Swiss cheese?
I think I'm more into Parmesan, actually.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. 50 Shades of Grey. Why has it affected society so much? Why is it selling off the charts? And is it awakening something that was always there, or creating something that wasn't there before?
I think probably more of the latter. I mean, I think this was an outlet for female sexuality overwhelmingly. I mean, there are men who have read 50 Shades of Grey, of course, but it is overwhelmingly a female audience of middle-aged women primarily that are attracted to the book. And I think it is telling about the particular sex dynamic in the book, which is a sadomasochistic one, where the woman is the masochistic or the submissive partner in the relationship, which fits quite clearly the scientific data about what women want in terms of that type of dynamic. So I think it's simply a reflection of these underlying desires that lots of people have.
I think you're right about the underlying desires, but the sadomasochistic theme is actually minor in this book. If you read all 3 volumes,
which I haven't.
Of course, no one has. I did.
I did read Story of O, which I thought was better than the first 50 Shades of Grey book. Anyway.
Well, yeah.
Original.
Well, that's a different animal.
Yeah.
But in this case, I think it speaks to women's repressed romantic/sexual longings in America today. I think there's a big problem between men and women, and men not making a courtship effort any longer.
Yeah, I do think that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I do think there's a sociological phenomenon happening with the 50 Shades of Grey as well, like you say, because it was authored by a woman. There are some fairly explicit sex scenes, fairly light in the sense of actual pornography, but still much more explicit than you would find in the average romance novel that women had been reading and had been consuming widely at the time. So I think it opened the door, allowing female sexuality at sort of just the right level for them to be comfortable with.
No, I want to pick up on what Betsy said. I do think that the thing that came out of 50 Shades of Grey is that women are saying, and rightfully so, when did I stop becoming the object of love and lust? When did you stop trying? Why do men always, after they settle down and they get involved in their businesses, stop pursuing and dating, their partners?
Right. Well, I suppose that they think that the deal is done at that point, and it's a very unfortunate sort of thing.
Well, your friend, our friend, Havelock Ellis, as you recall, he spent 75 pages just on the art of love. And he thought that this was the most important art that men and women can learn for sustaining long-term romantic relationships. And what he said basically is it's a continual courtship with a continual progression. And I think this is what women miss so desperately and why they latched onto this book the way they did. Also, there's the orgasm gap in America. I mean, women aren't having the same orgasms as men. And in 50 Shades, this woman is always satisfied. And wow, what a female fantasy that is for many, many, many women.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I talk about in Perv is the fact that we've got this very interesting type of psychological system, this social cognition, which allows us to take the perspective of somebody else when we're having sex with them. We can really sort of get into somebody's head, attribute all sorts of psychological feelings to them as we're having sex with them. And this could be something that's fundamentally different between us and even our most closely related species, chimpanzees, bonobos, that have, if you look at chimpanzee sex, it's just this sort of, rubbing their genitals together very quickly, 15 seconds, and then there's an orgasm. But for us, there really is this sort of lovemaking, and lust and love fit together in a way that you don't see in any other species. You have, I think, love in other species, you have lust in other species, but putting them together in such an intimate, romantic way like we can probably stems from the evolution of this fairly unique human cognitive system to take the perspective of somebody else. And that includes when you're actually having sex with them, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing.
I'm going to ask a question that sounds like a joke, but I mean it seriously. How about women who have fetishes with black American Express cards?
Yeah. Well, I guess where's she getting it from? That's a different question. But
no, and I mean that seriously. That isn't fetish also connected to the perceived wealth or intelligence or the way in which you're going to keep me in my lifestyle? Isn't there a fetish attached to that?
I don't know if I would call it a fetish. It might be sort of an exacerbated trait that has these underlying evolved characteristics. And I think it's important always, although I do think that there are all sorts of sociological quasi-postmodernist explanations for the nature of male and female sexuality and the differences between them. I do think it's important to keep in mind the fact that we are animals. We do have a biological basis as well. And there are some studies, for instance, showing that women have more orgasm. The frequency of female orgasm is positively correlated to their male partner's wealth. And that was published in the same journal issue as a study of, I think there were rhesus monkeys that were more likely, female rhesus monkeys were more likely to have orgasms when they were having sex with males of greater social status. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would call that a fetish in terms of women's.
It's obviously a correlation. Did the other monkey have a black American Express card?
the equivalent of that. I'm not sure that would be.
I think women underreport. I really do. I would treat that study with a great deal of skepticism.
I think a lot of men underreport as well. Not the frequency of having sort of heteronormative sex and orgasms, but they underreport all sorts of things too. So,
right. It's very difficult to extrapolate from that, it seems to me.
Yeah, but I do think that there are empirical ways to look at it. I do think that, these sort of, although they are kind of invasive, these physiological measures of arousal, whether it's vaginal vasocongestion, looking at blood flow to the female reproductive anatomy, or penile plethysmographs, looking at male erection to different types of stimuli. There are ways to test these hypotheses that I think, we're sort of just beginning to crack into them now.
So, Jess, tell our audience, what is formicophilia?
Formicophilia is an attraction to insects, particularly sort of beetles or ants or slugs, and putting them on the genitals, or basically the erogenous zones, the nipples, the anus, the genitals, while one is masturbating, and only being able to have an orgasm when these insects are touching you like that.
And how did you find these people?
They're actually more out there than you would think.
Okay.
They're all, these are, all of my data actually came from published case reports in the psychiatric literature. And I came across a handful. The one that I write about in the book, the formicophile that I write about in the book, was a young Indian man that, was spending all of his time digging around his garden for slugs and worms and beetles. For masturbation purposes, kind of like you were talking about earlier, somebody spending too much time looking at pornography. This is what he was doing, spending too much time looking for bugs to masturbate with. And it became a problem with him, and that's how he ended up in the psychiatrist's office.
I'd love to know what childhood trauma triggered that one.
Yeah.
He obviously doesn't do well with people. Jess, you've been a wonderful guest, and you really are allowing people, to actually think and ask the right questions. I think the two biggest concerns of mine is that the function of government is not to tell you who you should be with and why you should be with them. The function of government is to protect the innocent, but not to regulate the morality or the preferences of individuals. There are many things I want to thank you for, but our time is out. And it was a pleasure having you on my show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Take care.
Same to you.
I want to once again thank Jesse Bering for appearing on our show. Visit his website, jessebering.com, and go ahead and pick up a copy of his book. It won't be that disturbing. In fact, it might be enlightening. Perv on Amazon.com. Betsy, I think that which I wanted to really explore more and more is why are so many countries still to this day persecuting homosexuals and causing a large part of their population to be criminalized.
Yeah, I just wanted him to get into that even more. Why the policing of sexuality to the extent that we have it worldwide? And what underlies all of that? Is it fear? What is it all about?
I personally think it has a lot to do with a form of terrorism, a form of, if we cannot make you believe that which God demands, then we are doing a service to God by eliminating you. And I think that most religions, rather than doing what I feel their job is, which is to challenge people to live a highly more productive moral life for themselves, not to tell other people how to live, they in their inability to actually be competent in what they're doing, they find a target. In the same way that the Germans needed to boost their economy, they found the Jews to pick on. People need to pick on someone in order to organize themselves.
But the target is always inside. In other words, in this book, which was so interesting, I thought, he found that the most homophobic men are the most sexually aroused when you put them on one of those vasometers or
Sure.
whatever
I
he
mean,
calls it.
Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover, perfect example. So we internalize all of these things too. So the enemy is really within, not without. It's just a projection. So that raises the other question about sexuality itself and its nature and how scary it can be for many, many people.
I do think that people live in sexual fear of how their feelings, and I think that society, has really not in any way, shape, or form addressed the basic needs of protection, making sure that there is the ability for free markets to function and to make sure that people's individual rights are never trampled on. I am Dr. Errol Gluck. Betsy and I both want you to remember, to every problem there is a solution. Please check out our other episodes. There is something for everyone. You need to go to your LinkedIn and Facebook and tell all your friends to listen to Gluck Radio. And while you're doing that, go out and buy Betsy's Prelos books on the art of seduction on Amazon.com. They're entitled Swoon and Seductress. Keep listening and keep sending us your feedback. Maybe there's a show in there for you. Until next time.